being burnt out. Being burnt out is an emotional condition marked by tiredness, loss of interest, frustration, and interference with job performance. Due to the fact that this is a relatively new term in psychology, researchers are still determining different meanings and definitions on this topic. Being burnt out is an increasing problem in the psychological world, and even though it's a relatively new term in psychology, it has been a problem for some time. There is no real dominant solution to solve this issue of being burnt out because more research still has to be done to determine ways to avoid being burnt out. But what contributes to people being burnt out is a very stressful environment and also negative happenings that will also affect how you handle things and you'll eventually get burnt out if that's the case. So I looked at an experiment where a doctor explored the effects of being burnt out on physicians in the US. The study was done because no national study had ever evaluated the rate of being burnt out in the US, as well as physicians explored in different specialties or compared physicians with US workers in other fields. The group of doctors used the American Medical Association Physician Master File and surveyed a probability base of the general US population for comparison. They sent out surveys to 27,000 participants, and out of those, 7,000 participated. The results were assessed using the Matchlock Burnout Inventory. This is an example of what you would see in a Matchlock Burnout Inventory. It's not the exact same, but this is kind of a general overview of what you would see. It has questions about how you feel, are you tired that day, stuff that would relate to being burnt out. And it goes from a scale of 1 to never feeling that way to 7 to always or almost always feeling that way. The results of the experiment were that 45% of physicians have reported at least one symptom of being burnt out. The results go on to say that a substantial difference in burnt out were observed by specificity with the highest rates among physicians at the front line of care assessed. Compared with a probability-based sample of 3,000 working U.S. adults, physicians were more likely to have the syndromes of being burnt out, 37 to 27%. Highest levels of education completed are also related to burnt out. In the analysis, adjusted for the age, sex, relationship status, and hours work completed, those are also factors. Compared with the high school graduates, individuals with an MD or a DO degree were at increased risk for burnout with a ratio of 1.35, whereas individuals with a bachelor degree are 0.80, master's degree 0.71, or professional or doctoral degree other than the MD or DO degree were at a lower risk of burnout. The higher the education you go, the more burnt out you can get. That, with the factor of age, sex, and hours you have to put into your work, can all contribute. For experiment 2, we looked at 3 scientists that investigated a relationship between behavioral regulations and athlete burnt out, and to examine whether self-determined motivation mediated relationships between basic needs, satisfaction, and athlete burnout. The scientists hypothesized that the relationship between athlete burnout and behavioral regulation could vary according to their rank on the self-determination continuum. Specifically, a motivation and controlled regulation, external and interjected regulation would be a positively associated with athlete burnout, while autonomous regulation, intrinsic motivation, identified and integrated regulation would show negative associations. We also predicted that need satisfaction would be negatively related to athlete burnout, and that overall levels of self determined motivation would mediate the relationship. The survey had a 25-item behavioral regulation in sports questionnaires, which included six 4-item subclasses that assessed a motivation, external regulation, interjected regulation, identified regulation, integrated regulation, and intrinsic motivation. The results of the research found that basic need satisfaction scores showed negative correlation with all athlete burnout questionnaire scores. A motivation and controlled forms of motivation were positively correlated with all aspects of burnout, while autonomous forms of motivation showed negative relationships with all burnout scores. This means if your needs aren't met for whatever reason, you are more likely to experience burnout in your sport. But on the flip side, if you meet your needs and are self motivated, you are more likely not to get burnt out because there is no negative correlation for you there. In conclusion, being burnt out is a psychological condition that can happen across many different kinds of fields: the workplace, in sports among athletes, as musicians, and even in education as a teacher or a student. Variables such as the demands of your respected job, levels of education, the hours needed to be put into your job, and the positive or negative feedback basic needs all play a part in whether you are more prone to becoming burnt